Communication channels remain active with world leaders appearing intent to seek dialogue to address tensions and to promote solidarity. So what was the gist of the visit to Korea by the US envoy to the UN? Are economic challenges relevant in tackling foreign policy challenges? And do Japan's claims over Korea's Dokdo and its ritual offerings to the Yasukuni Shrine look to derail ties? Hello and welcome to Monday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sunhee. East Asia was recently the venue of much diplomatic discourse as delegates from the West were here in this part of the world to address security and more. For this, I have Professor Lim Eun-jung at Kongju National University live on the line. Professor Im, it's good to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Doctor Stephen Noerper, Head of Asia Dialogue, with us as well live on the line. Dr. Noerper, welcome back.
Thank you. Delighted to be back with you.
Professor Im, East Asia, including South Korea and Japan, played host to U.S. Ambassador to the UN Linda Thomas-Greenfield this past week. What do you believe was the purpose of this high-profile visit to this part of the world?
Well, first and foremost, I need to, emphasize how significantly, dramatically, global affairs have changed. Especially the two wars, again, are going on in Europe and the Middle East. Nobody wants to see another war or conflict, violence in this region, again, the East Asia. Of course, North Korea, which is very much like unfortunate, but they have kept, again, the threatening, not only just South Korea, but Japan or the United States, and they have been undermining the effectiveness of global regime, which is for the non-proliferation and which is against the nuclear weapons. Having said that, again, I do think Ambassador Greenfield, her visit to Korea and Japan this time was, again, the number one. U.S. certainly, U.S. is, of course, the ally of both, again, the South Korea and Japan. So they need to show the strong commitment to the allies. But at the same time, again, she's an ambassador to the United Nations, which means even though North Korea has been seeking for some loophole of the existing sanctions, or they have been trying to take advantages of Russia's isolations, but still UN as a whole or as an reliable international organization, I do think they do want to send some certain signal that, again, the UN is certainly with us, again, with South Korea and with Japan or with many other countries who are very much concerned about the stability and peace in this region.
Right. Expanding on something that our Professor Im has just said, Dr. Noerper, speaking to reporters here, Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield, she claimed a new mechanism will be in place to monitor UN sanctions on North Korea, despite last month's veto by Russia of such efforts. What are your thoughts with regard to the prospects of such a plan, a new monitoring mechanism, that is?
Well, what she's signaling is that there will be processes that take place both within the UN and outside the UN. And of course, it was important that it was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, not simply the Secretary of State or another official, because they wanted to signal that the United Nations still maintains its primacy and still has the active participation of the Northeast Asian members, to include North Korea. And so there is still a conditioning done by the United Nations. There will be an input in terms of monitoring, and they'll just simply have to adjust how that's done. And of course, the United Nations importantly brings good offices, which hopefully will get us back to a negotiating table. So the UN does have much to offer. However, given the Russian and Chinese actions, when it comes to the panel of experts, it seems that that curtailment means that the United States, South Korea, Japan, and allies like Australia, India, and others will step to the fore to look at enforcement and to try to better monitor what's happening in terms of North Korean developments. So that's essential. But really, this has been going on now for a couple of years where China and Russia were showing less than enthusiasm for that. But it does remind us that at some point we do need to get China and Russia back to the table to help. In the mid-teens, after the fourth nuclear test by North Korea, China actually co-sponsored the resolution with the United States. A different day, but still probably not outside the realm of possibility that we can get them back in. So it's important to maintain support for the United Nations, its good roles and good offices, as well as to develop monitoring. Lastly, we see in the G7 meeting that took place at the end of last week, Secretary of State Blinken and G7 foreign ministers making commitments about stemming crises around the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan. So East Asia was definitely on their radar, even though they were meeting in Capri.
Right. And in the meantime, with regard to sanctions, Professor Im, how effective have these sanctions been in keeping perhaps North Korea away from further pursuing its hostile weapons ambitions?
Well, since the 2006, the UN Security Council has passed nearly a dozen resolutions sanctioning North Korea, again, for developing its nuclear weapons and the related those activity. Of course, sanctions have been always controversial. Some will say, the probably the stronger, more powerful sanctions are necessary. But at the same time, others will say, as long as there are some players who make a kind of space for the North Korea, if so, there can be always, those kind of limitations, again, of the sanctions. Well, both can be right and both can be wrong. Sometimes we have seen real effectiveness of the sanctions. For example, when they came back to the negotiation table, 2018, many thought that the sanctions the international society has conducted was pretty much effective. But unfortunately, again, as long as there are certain countries who are still backing up North Korea, again, they always are trying to be elusive. And global South countries too. Actually, we really need a strong support and commitment of global South countries as well. According to the recent report, which was published in last year, actually, by the Small Arms Survey, according to that report, 62 countries out of 192 UN member states, which are going to be like more than 32%, they actually did not submit any single process report between the 2006 and 2022, which means, again, there can be still, many of those rooms, spaces for North Korea. So definitely, I think South Korea, not only South Korea, many other like-minded countries need to keep persuading global South countries as well to make their commitments, strong commitments for the strengthening, again, the effectiveness of existing sanctions.
Right then, keeping in mind what Professor Im has just said, Dr. Noerper, generally speaking, do economic sanctions remain a relevant tool for foreign policy challenges, do you think?
Well, as a professor of international relations, I would say they have a role, but they're only a tool. The chief tool should be that of negotiation. And we need to be putting more time and emphasis on that in the international community and looking at ways to get North Korea to a negotiating table to seek resolution and to stem those types of developments. Sanctions have their place, but sanctions are largely ineffective if they are not enforced by all members. And if we see China and Russia, for example, not having enforced sanctions in recent years, then sanctions against North Korea do not hold. North Korea knows that, the players know that, the international community knows that. So it weakens the sanctions regime. Washington, D.C.'s Center for Economic and Research and Policy Research determined in a study of 32 nations that only in only 2 instances did sanctions really work effectively. In 30, they did not. And so there have been very limited times and places. Something like South Africa's apartheid regime was effectively sanctioned, but it took the entire world and its backing to stem that and to force change in South Africa. But there are a lot of loopholes, and some of the things that we need to be concerned about are cutting off the international system's ability to move money, so that affects aid and the work of humanitarian workers. And we need to look at the fact that it disproportionately hurts the poor. So is it North Korea's people who are suffering rather than its leadership, which the sanctions are designed to try to persuade to curtail their nuclear and missile development? So the effectiveness of that means that it's really in question, and probably much more attention needs to be paid to negotiation and outcomes in that regard. And again, that brings in the effective offices of the United Nations and the multilateral community in terms of trying to support a process that gets us talking, not simply relying on sanctions, which are oft overused as a convenient political tool.
Right. Moving forward, Professor Im, President Yoon Suk-yeol and his Japanese counterpart Fumio Kishida spoke on the phone back on Wednesday to reaffirm their shared stance on a number of issues, including North Korea. Now, this particular conversation came after Tokyo's latest claim over South Korea's islets of Dokdo, and they also came before the ritual offerings by the Japanese leader to the Yasukuni Shrine, which took place this past weekend. What's your take, Professor Im, on Japan's repeated claims over Korea's Dokdo islets and its offerings to the shrine? I mean, what does it seek to gain from these actions?
Well, obviously, it is not unhappy news for Korean people, and not only just for Korean people. Actually, Yasukuni Shrine is really controversial symbol of Pacific War, which can be sometimes offensive even to the American people too. But however, at the same time, you know, in terms of domestic politics, Japanese politicians, they are elected voters too. So they regularly do offer something. I mean, again, offer their offerings to the Yasukuni Shrine, or regularly, annually. In April, they publish the Blue Book, diplomatic Blue Book. So spring is really can be a kind of sensitive time for the two countries' relationship. But however, at the same time, I also want to mention this again. We probably don't need to mix this historical disputes, with some other issues. Again, regarding the Dokdo, South Korea's position is very crystal clear. Again, we don't even think this is a disputable issue. So this is almost like we don't need to fight over and over, because it's obviously it's under our jurisdiction, and obviously it is our territory. So we don't need to probably, overly sensitive unnecessarily. And at the same time, we also need to keep talking about possible cooperation with Japan regarding more realistic, pragmatic, and serious issues like, again, the North Korea's nuclear program, or even climate change like global affairs, or reorganization of existing global value chains, which really are very much impactful to the both economies. So again, I will recommend for all of us again to just separate the issues by issues. Again, I don't want to mix everything together.
Right then. Professor Noerper, well, Dr. Noerper, speaking as a professor who is teaching beyond this particular region, what are your thoughts regarding how differences in history and territory may ultimately affect our diplomatic ties? By that, I mean, of course, ties shared between Seoul and Tokyo.
Well, Professor Im is quite right to be cautious and to urge us to look at the nuances here. The relationship is very important. I mean, historically, well before the 20th century, Korea and Japan have been a natural economic territory. Today, in the modern world, they share so much in common. Democratic systems and common values, enthusiasm culturally in K-pop, K-drama, J-pop, J-League, K-League, the people-to-people context, heavy economic momentum, the need now in the post-pandemic world to create more stable supply chains between Japan and Korea. That's really essential. And so good relations really are key. Before the pandemic and before the difficulties in relations between Japan and Korea just immediately prior, Japan had been the largest employer of Korean graduates, not the United States, not China. So Japan and Korea have much in common and much to do. This is not a partisan issue. It's really it's nonpartisan, or it's in the interest of all parties in Korea to see a healthy economic and political relationship. What we have to be careful of here is that people at the political level are not using this for their own political purposes to sway public opinion. And at a time when the polls are hurting for both Yoon Suk-yeol as well as Kishida in Japan, oftentimes political leaders will migrate to issues of territorial concern or history and popular memory. And it's very important that we try to avoid that and being trapped into it. Fact of the matter is, on Dokdo, Korea has already won the court of international public opinion. Even some in Japan quietly and begrudgingly say that they look at the East China Sea and look at Korea's handling of Dokdo as something of a model. The idea of doing common conservation areas and other types of cooperation around it. And in terms of historical memory, that Japan politicians not be relying on things like shrine visits to curry favor among conservatives, when in fact toning that down is appropriate in terms of recognizing the importance of the relationship with South Korea. So it really behooves all political parties in both nations to continue to move forward. And the U.S., of course, has a great interest in seeing its two strong democratic allies working together in the region, especially given concerns about China, Russia, and North Korea.
Right, and speaking about the Trilateral Alliance, Professor Im, top finance officials from Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington gathered in the U.S. Capitol for their first Trilateral Finance talks last week, I believe. Now, the local media here made quite a bit of deal with regard to that gathering. What do you believe was the relevance of that meeting?
Well, I think the specific meeting was pretty much meaningful, and it did certainly gave some signals, positive signals to the market. Again, the Korean and the Japanese economy these days are pretty much suffering from the biggest problem these days is, again, inflation. Well, there can be, of course, many different reasons for inflation. First and foremost, absolutely the COVID-19 pandemic provided a kind of fundamental basis for potential of the inflation. But after that, again, the U.S. as high interest rate, of course, which is against the inflation too. But the high interest rates of the United States, having had that, again, many other countries, including, again, the Korea and Japan, cannot, again, depreciate, cannot reduce their interest rate either, which also can be, again, related to the inflation. So inflation is really, painful for ordinary people of the two countries. And as long as inflation is that much kind of serious issue for the two economies. Again, their economic, the kind of stability or strength is also related to the security issue. Economic security cannot be separated from the national security. So having had all this complex situation, how Washington, again, the Tokyo and Seoul, how much, again, how cooperative, how communicative these three parties can be. I think the market players, they are watching this. So in that sense, I did see the specific meeting was pretty much, again, the encouraging policy coordination is definitely, I think, necessary for this moment.
Right. And Dr. Noerper, Korea's economic concerns being aggravated by potential, that is, fears of a wider war in the Middle East. Having said that, what are your prospects with regard to that scenario?
Well, we have to be concerned about the global conflicts, and Korea plays an increasingly important role We have seen that in terms of its heavy diplomatic activity. You mentioned in your news report the diplomatic chiefs of mission meeting and talking about a plethora of global security challenges in Seoul just today. And it's important to note that in crafting their policy, they're working alongside countries like the United States, Japan, working within a multilateral framework. Those three are all on the Security Council at the United Nations this year. That's all incredibly important for trying to forge solutions, especially when it comes to very difficult crises that are seeing a real cost of lives in places like Ukraine, in the Gaza, and when we see a flare-up in tensions, especially that between Iran and Israel. And it reminds us that there can be an acceleration of conflict very quickly. And of course, that's the type of thing we want to avoid on the Korean Peninsula, where you have an escalatory effect. And Iran and Israel, to this point, have limited their reactions. The international diplomatic community has been active in trying to stem that. Again, the G7 and other bodies have been active to try to limit responses. But we need to avoid those types of flashes and outbreaks, and we need to really address the humanitarian cost in Gaza. Again, this will really require a lot of solidarity and a lot of cooperation, especially as we see North Korean weaponry in places like Ukraine and potentially even in the Middle East. We need to find ways to stem lethal interaction and try to promote diplomacy and try to address humanitarian needs as soon as possible.
Right, by having constructive communication, of course, as you mentioned, Dr. Noerper. Right then, thank you so much, Dr. Noerper, for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Im, thank you very much for your insights.
Aloha, thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. Do join us again, same time tomorrow.